A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, as stated earlier, our special focus today is on last night's federal budget. It's a third budget handed down by Treasurer Jim Chalmers. And the big challenge has been how to contain inflation while trying to bring the cost of living relief to Australians who are desperately in need of it. Our two guests today join us to unpack the issues in the budget and also bring in Christian commentary. We have Professor Rod St. Hill, a Christian economist. His background is in banking and higher education. These days he serves as a pastor at Ignite Life Church on the Gold Coast. He devotes his time to church, business as a mission, and kingdom initiatives. Rod is also a recent addition to the Vision Christian Media Board. And we also have from Melbourne, Gavin Martin, the founder of Cornerstone Wealth. He's the senior financial advisor there with a business model founded on the idea that a person's true worth is not measured by financial net worth, but rather that the individual is of far more value. Gentlemen, I would like to welcome you both to 2020 today to help us unpack this federal budget.
It's great to be with you, Andrew.
Gavin, are you happy to be here too?
Yeah, great to be with you, Andrew.
Just want to make sure your mic was working. Okay, gentlemen, so I'm going to start with you, Gavin, because you're in Melbourne, and we all know Melbourne people are very sophisticated urbanites. And so what are your overall impressions of this federal budget?
Yeah, it's definitely a high tax, high spending budget. And as you mentioned in the intro, it does really risk poking the inflation bear and causing more pain than the initiatives it's seeking to provide relief by. Yeah, so I think it's going to be a real challenge, a fine line. It's got those typical election sweeteners in there to try to help their chances at the election next year. But as you mentioned, the biggest thing is going to be inflation and keeping that under control, because the initiatives will be really tiny compared to if they have to raise interest rates later on in the year.
Can I ask, Gavin, were you surprised by anything in the budget?
It's probably not a surprise from the budget, but I was surprised in looking at the details of the budget. One massive surprise for me was the stage 3 tax cuts that are going to start next financial year. They're going to cost $1.3 billion over the next 5 years, but the actual income tax take over the last 12 months, so last year to this year, has gone up $40 billion. So it's actually a very small amount of giving back some of that additional tax take. And I'm sure Rod will chip in and complain about the budget. The government getting bigger and bigger, and but it really does show how little they are returning back to taxpayers with those income tax cuts.
Yeah, okay. So Rod St. Hill, we'll go to you now. What were your overall impressions of this budget?
Well, look, I couldn't have said it better than Gavin did, quite frankly. I'm in furious agreement with him. But look, I don't think the budget addressed the real core issues that need to be faced in Australia today. The biggest issue for households is that our disposable income, after paying our taxes, after paying interest on our loans, and after adjusting for inflation, is falling. The Reserve Bank of Australia published some data early this year that showed that since 2022, that real disposable income has fallen by 5.5%. That's a big drop. The other thing which we really need to be watching, and there's no real mention of this in the budget at all, is that the productivity of labour is falling. And you cannot, in the long term, enhance living standards if you don't get labour productivity up. There's nothing in this budget that in the long term either addresses the fall in real disposable income, nor does anything in this budget address the problems that we have with labour productivity. And labour costs are actually going up. So we're getting worse and worse off, but it's costing more and more to produce what we consume.
Which is ironic, isn't it? Because this budget was allegedly all about rebooting manufacturing in Australia.
Oh, that's rubbish. That is absolute rubbish. What's happening is the government is picking a handful of winners and spending a lot of our money on those so-called winners. Some of those things may pay off, but look, history tells us governments are really bad at picking. They're not good at investment of any kind. And why would you expect politicians to be good? Most of them have never had any experience in business. And then they think that there won't be a future of manufacturing in Australia, quite frankly. And most of the subsidies will end up in the pockets of big business and people who are already very, very wealthy. It really is not the way forward. We turned our back on that under the Hawke-Keating government. And we seem to be going back to the pre-1970s position. Not good for the outlook for Australia at all.
Yeah, and that 5% drop in real disposable income, Gavin, that has a really a big impact on our society, doesn't it, at large? Like, what sort of ways does that impact our society, that drop in disposable income in households?
It really, and particularly with interest rates going up, 14 times over the last 12 months or so, it's a massive impact on budgets, and a lot of people out there are hurting. It's making it very difficult for young people. I think really about the X and Y and Z generation. They've got so many struggles. There's been a few little initiatives like the HEX, capping of HEX at either inflation or wage increases, which helps a little bit, but it's just a small drop in the ocean compared to what needs to happen to enable these, those two generations to have any sort of long-term chance of getting into the housing market without having to rely on the bank of mum and dad.
Yeah. And obviously, Rod, that drop in disposable income, it's going to affect business too, isn't it? Like retail outlets and...
Well, the problem is if our income falls, we don't spend as much. That's the real problem. Frankly, the only reason why our GDP in total is growing, that is why the size of the economic pie overall is growing, is because of massive immigration, because migrants have to spend money. They've got to live just like the rest of us. So the massive migration intake has really pumped up the overall level of income, but at the same time, of course, individual income is actually falling in real terms after you make those appropriate adjustments.
Yeah, and so I've heard it said that the massive migration and the money they bring, it's a false economy. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, look, it's like so many things in economics. There's a certain level which is actually highly positive and productive. Now, that level is probably less than 200,000. Now, the government in this budget have said they're going to reduce immigration by half, but to 250,000. I don't think we can even absorb that many. So it should be well under 200,000, probably something like the long-term average, which is more like 150, 160,000, and well targeted.
Yeah. What's your take on the migration issue, Gavin? I mean, you live in Melbourne. Is Melbourne just bursting at the seams of people looking for housing, looking for rentals, lots of people looking for jobs?
Yeah, definitely. It's bursting at the seams. There's a housing crisis, both in the rental and the purchasing of houses. There's undersupply. I think there's some initiatives in the budget to try to get rid of some of the red tape to make that improve that. But yeah, just little tinkering around the edges, the rental assistance, those that are getting payments from the government and getting support to help them pay for their rent. Rental assistance is going to go up 10%, but again, it's a drop in the ocean for those people. The rents are going up a lot more than 10%. So it's a real challenge, and immigration, is probably an area that needs to be looked at. Yeah.
Yeah, what's your take on it, Rod? Do you think that the immigration that this current government's involved in, I mean, some cynical voices may say it's vote farming. They're literally bringing people groups in, building loyalty with them and connections so that they always vote Labor Greens in the future. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I'm an economist, not a political scientist, but that's possibly part of the thinking, but it's always been part of the Labor platform. They've always been very strongly in favour of immigration, and I think not really so they'll get more votes. It's just part of their DNA, and they have great sympathy and empathy with people who are not doing as well as we are. I think the problem is they want to do a whole lot in a big hurry, and this is not the right time to be doing that. It's as simple as that. And I think, look, there are other issues. I think there is very strong biblical guidance on how nations are formed and how nations are supposed to develop, and we are supposed to preserve culture. And with such large rates of immigration and with our own multicultural policy, we haven't been careful enough to preserve culture. And we're seeing that in all kinds of ways at the moment. And so I think we have to have a long, hard look at the whole migration issue.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Gavin, before we move on from that particular issue?
And I think Rod's covered it. Yeah, not my area of expertise either.
Well, let's talk about, some tax relief is on the way and these stage 3 tax cuts, which take effect on July 1st. Gavin, can you just give us a brief rundown? What do these stage 3 tax cuts mean for the average person?
Yeah, so someone on $50,000 a year will save like $929 like in tax. Someone on $100,000 is just over $2,000. If you're earning $150,000, it'll be nearly $4,000, so $3,700. And then someone over $200,000, the tax savings are about $4,500. So reasonably significant. Labor adjusted them to be focused more at the lower income level rather than the higher income level. I think previously someone over 200 was going to save double that amount. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. That was not a bad approach to the tax cuts. So really good. But most of those, for people that have got mortgages, a lot of those savings will go directly into the increased interest payments on their mortgage. For retirees who are seeing higher interest rates, getting better returns on their deposits in the bank, I think they're sitting in a lot better space than perhaps those that have got mortgages and taken them out in recent years, or those people that are trying to get into the housing market. But good to see some tax cuts. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the increased receipts that they've got from bracket creep. As salaries increase, you push into the next tax level.
Yeah, and Professor Rodson Hill, what's your take on these stage 3 tax cuts?
Well, of course, we know they were legislated some years ago. They were part of a package which was supposed to address primarily the whole issue of bracket creep, and part of the design was that we would stay within a single tax bracket over a much larger range of income, and so it would only be people right at the top end who would get caught up in the highest marginal rate of income tax. That's been watered down somewhat with these changes, so the underlying principles have been tampered with. One of my issues, I agree with Gavin that, it makes some sense to load the relief at the lower income scale, but I don't like it when a government makes a promise and then doesn't keep it. So in opposition, there were promises made about passing on those stage 3 tax cuts in full, and that promise wasn't kept. I think that's a big problem for government. I think we need to be able to trust those who govern us.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But do you think the average Australian does trust our federal government?
Well, surveys certainly show that politicians are not held in very high regard.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that as well. But so getting back to these stage 3 tax cuts, I mean, Gavin quoted numbers there of how many thousands of dollars people are saving depending on their income. But how does that work? How's the money saved? Does it come back in a tax return, or do you pay less tax each week?
Well, for those of us who are in employment, we just should see a little bit more money in our bank account every fortnight. That's how it will happen.
Okay.
And so we might see 10, 15, 20, 30 more dollars in our bank account. Most of us are going to spend that pretty quickly because interest rates are high, and they are likely to remain fairly high for a long time now, because although in the current year there will be a budget surplus, we're looking at budget deficits into the future. So, I mean, it's a silly way of going about dealing with inflation. You can't spend your way out of an inflationary problem. So it's all fine and dandy for us to get a little tiny bit of relief on our power bills, a little tiny bit of relief on our rent and so on. And for some lucky individuals, some relief on their HECS debt. Certainly not lucky for those people who have actually paid their HECS debt. But anyway, that's another issue. But you can't, that kind of spending is itself inflationary. So you can't deal with inflation by monetary handouts.
Yep. So, okay, I'm going to ask you now, Professor Rodson Hill, out of 10, what are you going to give this budget?
I heard someone give it a 2 this morning. I think I'd probably give it about a 4.
You give it a 4, okay.
Yeah, that's out of 10.
Yeah, and 40%, so it's a fail. I'm going to call it a fail, not yet competent. And but what were you expecting? Were you expecting about a 4?
No, I wasn't expecting much good, I would have to say. In fact, I didn't even listen to the budget speech in the Parliament last night. There's no point because it doesn't provide information. It's absolutely almost bereft of any kind of content. It's just a political act. So I didn't waste time watching it. Instead, I got up early this morning and looked at the data. And I haven't actually listened to many commentaries either. But I did note that I haven't heard too many economists say anything positive about this budget.
Yeah, which says a lot. I did look at the Australian Financial Review too this morning, and I didn't see a lot of positive commentary in there. Gavin, what's your mark out of a 10 for this budget?
Oh, gee, you might just give it a pass, maybe a 5.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
Yeah. I think relating to the trust issue, I think one of the promises, I think, back in 2021 was the promise that energy bills were going to be $275 less under Labor. And I think I'm a bit sceptical about the $300 of energy rebates, just trying to address that from a political issue. So really just focusing on that's going to counter the argument that that's a broken promise, and so give people $300 and it addresses that broken promise. And then secondly, it's almost a tricky way to reduce inflation as well. So it's giving a rebate on energy bills means that cost impact or that input into the inflation figures are then reduced. But it's not by reducing actual energy prices, it's by some trickery and refunding with a rebate. So I think that they should really focus on getting the energy policy correct and reducing energy prices that way rather than the backdoor approach to just giving rebates or subsidies on energy bills.
Well, let's talk about the energy crisis. So why, like the average person listening right now, their electricity bill's gone up. What is the key issue? Why is Australia, that is so rich in coal and natural resources, why do we pay so much for our electricity, Gavin? Do you know?
I think partly it's around the transition to renewables and the fact that, for example, the Greens don't want to open any more gas fields. There's plenty of gas available in Australia, but the policy settings are not conducive. I've got friends who work in the gas sector, and they could, multiple businesses could be out there opening new gas fields and keeping the price of gas lower, increasing supply. Gas is a good transition supply of energy as they move to more renewables, but the policy settings mean that it's difficult to get those new fields going. So I think the way that they changed policy last budget didn't actually help prices. It's really by, like housing, you need more housing. Again, you need more supply of resources in the meantime, whilst renewables aren't picking up the slack.
Professor Rod, would you add anything to that? What is the issue with power prices in Australia? What's causing it?
I do agree it's the transition to renewables without a really decent policy for what they call firming. So we're not really providing for peak demand. So if we have a very cold winter or a very hot summer, we simply cannot produce enough electricity to cover demand, because we're putting all our eggs in one basket, essentially. And I think that's one of the big problems. And the other problem is that as we make this transition to renewals, it is very, very expensive to build the new transmission assets that we need in order to do that. So although it's true to say that energy from the sun, energy from the wind is free, that is, in a sense, true. It is very expensive to get that electricity from the site at which it is produced into our homes. And so we're just going to see continual significant increases in electricity prices. And the irony is we've got a government, it subsidises the production and it subsidises our power bills, and we still get increases in electricity prices. And I think it's a terrible tragedy for our nation, because we have the potential to have the cheapest electricity in the world.
Now we're opening up talkback lines. What are your thoughts on this budget. What was your take on it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did it surprise you, or was it what you expected? There's no right or wrong answers here. We're not taking sides. We are just opening up the talk lines on 1-800 316 316. We would love to hear your thoughts. Now, Rodson Hill, I just want to ask you now, philosophically, how do you view this budget, and what does it reflect that is perhaps a phenomena in the modern world?
One of the things that concerns me about it is simply the size of government. This is something I have talked about for many, many years now. The government's tax take in total is around 26% of the total value of what we produce in this nation in a year. And as we look at the forward estimates, it's only going to fall down to about 25.1, 25.2%. And we're not the biggest government in the world, by the way. There are many other governments, many other countries where government represents as much as half of the economy. Now, much of that is not productive. It's not really adding to our capacity to produce the goods and services that people use to satisfy their needs and wants. A lot of it is administrative. And we've got a federal government that's got a Department of Education, a Department of Health, all these kinds of things. They don't run hospitals and they don't run schools.
Yeah.
So we've got huge bureaucracies. We're going to employ another 36,000 public servants, federal public servants, to say nothing of what's going on in the states. So I think that what we're looking at into the future, we're looking at two classes of citizen. The class which is well looked after because they are government employees. We saw that in COVID. We see, if you have a look at not just the salaries, but if you have a look at the overall conditions of employment in the public service, the private sector could not replicate them. They'd go out of business. Just impossible.
Yeah, it's unsustainable.
And so when you get big bureaucracies, they need things to do, and inevitably what it does is it infringes upon our own freedom. It infringes upon our own capacity to make economic decisions. It infringes upon the capacity of businesses to make business decisions. And I think gradually it just emasculates a whole economy. And it's slow, and I think that's one reason why we allow it to happen. It's like the boiling frog syndrome. And governments seem to be utterly incapable of shrinking. And we need shrinking government at all levels, not just at the federal level, but at all levels. Because as we lose our freedom, we also lose our capacity to innovate. We lose our capacity to react or even anticipate economic upheaval. And so I think it's not an easy thing to do. You need a 25-year plan to do this. Politicians typically only look to the next election. They don't look forward to the next 25 years. And we do need to have a long-term outlook on what is best for the nation of Australia.
Yeah, well said. And it sounds like you would say that we also need a visionary leader in Australia who can
Look, we do.
Yeah.
I've been watching politics since the days of Sir Robert Menzies. That's how long I've been on the planet. And we've been poorly served by governments in the main. The Hawke-Keating government did some really good things which set us on a path for economic growth and development over a long period of time, as did the Howard Costello government. And the Abbott Hockey government had great potential. In fact, I haven't been happy with the federal budget since their first budget. I thought that was a great budget. It appears I was one of the few in the nation who did, because it was scuttled in the Senate. In particular, the co-payment for Medicare was scuttled in the Senate, and most of their budget initiatives unravelled. And of course, we know that Hockey lost his position, Abbott lost his position. We've never had a decent government since. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, and you're entitled to your opinion. And we've also got a caller who's called in, and it's GT from Victoria, and we'll ask GT for their comment or question. GT, welcome to the program today.
Hi guys, lovely to be here. I'm sorry I really haven't rang in before. I've just recently moved to Warrnambool, and just quickly to go back to that last caller, I agree. Australia really needs some good, godly Christian politicians. You know, for ages we've been letting the majority politics dictate and everything else, but I want to stay positive. I'm a guy that, just quickly and briefly, only got married last year. 56, first time ever married. And the reason that I'm saying that is one of the best things that God brought about, I suppose, through good old Dan Andrews. Now, love him or hate him, he actually blessed country Victoria by slashing the rail prices. And it used to cost me $80 to commute down to court or date, depending on what era you're in. My now wife. And I just want to say that he did one of the best things by slashing that rail price. And I talk to people, well, I'll be honest, I'm from Warrnambool. I talk to Warrnambool people all the time, and they absolutely love the fact that he's done that, because it's made a lot of them that are working from home to commute back up to the office from time to time for a lot cheaper. So, yeah.
GT, let me ask you, you said it used to be $80. What does it cost now on the train?
Well, a single trip's about $10.20. A return trip for me, this is adult, no concession, is $21. Now, I ride a motorbike, and it costs me $70 to do a return trip. So that gives you some idea. I can't even put the fuel in the motorbike for that price.
Yeah, but and by the way, that's the first positive comment I've ever heard about Dan Andrews, so well done for that, GT. But I 100% agree with you too that we need good, godly leaders in Australia. But then some would argue, wouldn't they, and I might ask Gavin for your thoughts on this, we did have a Christian Prime Minister, but a lot of Christians I know were actually disappointed with our Christian Prime Minister because they didn't think he did have much vision or much initiative, that not much really changed. Just quickly, Gavin, what are your thoughts on that?
On
the need of a Christian leader, yeah, like needing a Christian leader, and will that solve the problems of Australia?
I don't think it'll solve the problems of Australia, but just touching base on GT's comment, it's been a great initiative, the $10 fares around Victoria. Families taking advantage of it. It's been wonderful in terms of consumers using the service. But when you look at the Victorian $10 billion budget deficit, it's just another way that Dan Andrews spent and just has left us with a big mess after he's left politics. So it's great, but it's sort of a bit unconnected from reality, really. And we do need to take some initiatives in Victoria to get the budget back under control again. In terms of Christian leaders, it'd be great to get some more Christian leaders at the federal and state level. It's just a very hard game in politics these days. I speak to lots of young people that have considered it and then think, oh, mate, it's all just a bit too hard. So we need some, to raise some strong Christian people that can handle the rough and tumble of politics and do it whilst maintaining their strong faith, or do it through their strong faith.
Yeah, Rodson Hill, we've only got about 50 seconds till news, but what's your take on that? Is a Christian leader the answer for Australia, or do we need more than just a Christian leader?
We've had one and wasn't the answer, so I think that's it. No, it's not necessarily true that a Christian leader will produce better results. And one of the reasons is they've got to convince their party room, they've got to convince a parliament as well. So even a good Christian leader will not necessarily make much progress.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the 20th century, some of the greatest leaders weren't Christians. I mean, Ataturk from Turkey, he was a great leader. I mean, he led Turkey through the Gallipoli campaign. He helped defeat the Allies, and then he became a great leader of the nation and was very secular. In a Muslim nation, he was balanced, and I think he did a lot of good for Turkey, and he wasn't Christian. I guess it's that inner character, isn't it, or that ability to lead people that we probably need, someone with a vision and a real determination to see it happen. But GT, really glad you called us today. You're a first-time caller, mate. Great to have first-time callers. Call us again sometime. We really appreciate you calling in.
No worries. Thank you very much for your program.
Gentlemen, what I want us to tackle now in this next half an hour or so is this issue of inflation. But before we get there, Gavin, I just want to ask you to talk to us about the HECS debt relief that the government has provided in this budget.
Yeah, so the initiative is costing $3 billion, and it's a response to the fact that inflation was so high last year that in July, when HECS debts indexed up. They were previously indexed up with inflation, and with a high inflation rate, that meant that HECS debts for everyone that had one went up significantly. They just jumped significantly, so 7% or the like. And it's very difficult for that generation to then pay off that debt. And so they've responded, the government's responded by changing the indexing up of those HECS debts to either the lowest of CPI or wage inflation. And so and they're going to backdate it to July of last year. So they'll reduce those debts overall so that it's a little less painful for those people that have those debts. It's very difficult for someone in those two generations to rack up a debt so high and then have to try to pay for it through their income tax, and at the same time try to pay for a house or a mortgage or rent. So I think it's a good initiative, but it doesn't go anywhere near enough, I believe. And other things like potentially not indexing it until they start paying it off, or something along those lines would actually help those people. Yeah,
okay. That's a fair call. And Rod St Hill, do you want to add anything to that, or you agree with that? Or?
No, not really. I'm not as enthusiastic about it as Gavin is, but my perspective is we've got too many people in universities. We have far too many people going through university. We don't have the right jobs for them. Most people are overqualified for what they do, and I think we need to shift the mix towards the vet sector, where look, it's perfectly a good choice for somebody to choose a trade. We need more people in the trades, and look, if you're a tradie, as long as you are wise with your money, you can build up a significant wealth portfolio, and I'm sure Gavin can explain how to do it in 2 or 3 very easy steps. So I think we need to get away from this notion that we need more and more people to go through university. We don't, and in the long term, it is probably not doing our economy any great favour.
Yep. Okay, fairly hardline stance there on university education coming from a professor, Rod St Hill. Now, we do have a caller, Neil from Tamworth. Neil, have you got a comment or a question for us today?
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, the government is very proud to announce that they've come in under budget, but what is happening with the massive debt, international debt we made up during the COVID era?
Yep, so that's a question. What's happening to our national debt? Rod St Hill, you're the economist. We might ask you to address this one. What's happening to our national debt?
Overall, it's growing. As you look through what they call the forward estimates over the next few years, it will grow to about $1.2 trillion. That's just the federal government debt. You've got basket states like Victoria who are going to add to that as well. But, yeah, we're going to go well over the $1 trillion mark in terms of our debt, our national debt.
How does that affect a nation? Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Look, for people who hold that debt, it's quite a good thing because they get interest payments, but those interest payments have to come out of the budget. And so you end up with a very large expenditure that you cannot avoid. And so what that means, of course, is there's less money available for other things, like better health services, better services for pensioners and so on. There's always a trade-off.
Yep. So, okay, who's the debt to? Who do we owe who will we owe $1.2 trillion?
Well, it depends on who holds that debt. Some of it will be held by people in Australia. Some of it undoubtedly will be held by people overseas.
Yeah, okay.
But the point is the government will be squeezed because it has to pay interest on that debt, and ultimately it'll have to pay it back, or it could roll it over, but the interest payments will continue.
Yep. Neil, does that answer your question?
Yes, and it's a bit of a concern, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it is, because I'll be dead before the debt's paid off, so it'll actually be my children and possibly their children who end up having to pay for it. I think one of the things, we as a society, I think we really need to have a discussion about the ethical basis for government. And one of those bases is that it's not the government's money to spend. It's our money, and it's our children's money. And politicians don't have the right to spend money in a way that isn't entirely responsible and doesn't really fit in with a long-term view about what is best for our nation. And they certainly shouldn't be making decisions on spending our money based on potential votes in an election.
Yeah, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you want to add something to that as well, Neil?
No. I'm glad that my understanding of it is roundabout correct.
Well, good on you, Neil. We really appreciate you calling in. Was it a bit chilly in Tamworth this morning?
A little bit cool, yes. Haven't started the frost yet.
Just a bit fresh, eh? Not too fresh?
Not too fresh.
Good on you, Neil. Well,
Lovely there.
thanks for calling in, huh?
Righto, thank you. Bye.
See you, mate. Okay, gentlemen, let's talk about inflation. Inflation is obviously a big issue in our economy right now. So, Professor Rodson Hill, tell us the issue with inflation in Australia.
Well, the problem with inflation is that it makes our dollar go a little less far than it did last year or last month. And so if your income isn't at least keeping pace with inflation, you're worse off. And that has been the experience of the average household in Australia over the last few years. And so what we really need from a federal government is a budget which actually assists the Reserve Bank in terms of bringing interest rates down. Now, our interest rates are not anywhere nearly as high as they have been historically, but relative to what they were a couple of years ago, they are high. And so the average mortgage payer is finding that they have to pay somewhere between maybe $15,000 even $30,000 more on their mortgage each year. That's almost like having to find another wage.
It's a big hit, isn't it?
Absolutely. And look, this affects everybody, including high income earners. And in fact, it's the highest income earners who are the ones who are more likely to have a house with a mortgage. And I was looking at some data from the Roy Morgan research organisation this morning, and the proportion of households at risk as a result of the increase in mortgage rates is nearly as high as it was in the global financial crisis now. And it's just crept up on us since the government payout stopped after COVID. And it's not really receiving very much airtime in the media, but it's a significant risk, especially given that unemployment is going to increase. And the government's admitted to that in the budget papers. Not a big increase, but nevertheless it will tip some families over the edge.
Yeah, wow. You got any thoughts on that as well, Gavin?
Yeah, I think it's all really to do with the government's spending addiction, and they keep on addressing symptoms of problems, not the cause. So the energy rebate, $300, is addressing energy costs by a rebate, not by reducing energy costs, the cause of the problem. We're looking at rental assistance going up. So they're addressing the symptom and they're not addressing the cause of the problem. So they throw money at problems, but throw money at symptoms and not the actual cause. And I think that's the underlying problem that causes money to float around the economy and work counter to the RBA's increasing of interest rates. So I think if they were a bit more wise or targeted with their money, then I think with the way that they spend money, it would both put more downward pressure on inflation and help everybody. Yeah, because at the moment, it's looking like this budget is going to push out any interest rate decrease, at least until the end of the year or potentially next year, if at all.
Yeah, okay. So that's a big statement there. So say that again. This budget, how's it going to affect interest rates, which affect most people because most people have a mortgage?
It's probably going to push out a decrease in interest rates, which was expected later this year or early next year. It's going to probably push it out further.
So there's no foreseeable signs now of our interest rates going down on our mortgages?
Not as it stands at the moment, I would suggest most economists. I think there's only one bank now that thinks that there's going to be an interest rate cut before the end of the calendar year. Yeah.
Rodson Hill, have you got some thoughts on that?
I'll just say ditto.
Yep. So inflation is a big issue. Rodson Hill, let's ask your thoughts on this. Do you think Jim Chalmers knows how to bring inflation down, or do you think he really tried to bring inflation down on this budget?
I don't know him. I've never talked with him. He's never been a student of mine, so I don't really know. And I don't know that we can blame the whole lot on Jim Chalmers anyway. Look, to be fair to the Labor government, Labor tends to be elected just prior to or in the early stages of an economic crisis. And this time they were elected just prior to. something like, I think, 12 or 13 increases in interest rates because inflation was getting out of control. Now, they weren't the cause of that. Much of that was something which built up over a period of time, but primarily through the great amount of increased spending during the COVID period. So they inherited a fairly, if you like, an inflationary bias to the economy. I think one of the problems that Labor has is that they don't recognise that. And so they come into power and they have this great dream of changing Australia, and they don't pay enough attention to the economic environment. And I think that's the main issue with this government and with the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers himself. I just don't think they take enough cognizance of the environment that they inherit. Sure, they blame everything on the previous government or whatever's happening overseas, but they don't make enough adjustment in the timelines of the introduction of their policies and their implementation to take that into account. And that's why we end up with longer periods of higher inflation than otherwise would be the case.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, do you think there is enough competency in the current Labor Greens government and the sort of people who are involved in modern government? Because you've said something about big government. It's a recent phenomenon in the Western world. Everyone's got big governments now. Do you think that governments today actually have enough competency to manage an economy? Or are they just full of university students with big ideals who go through the political system and end up as politicians?
Look, I think they become the captives of theories, and I think in recent times modern monetary theory kind of held a lot of politicians and policy advisors captive, and that was really the idea that you could keep cranking up the supply of money, and as people spend that would bring forth extra supply, and so inflation in the long term wouldn't be a great problem, and you'd have full employment of all your resources. But look, the problem there is the assumption that increased production will follow. Now, if it doesn't, prices will have to rise, or the government will have to rein in its spending, or we have to borrow big and pay the price later down the track. So I haven't met many politicians who I would say are incompetent, but I do think they're captives of fads in economic and other theory, as are their advisors. And look, this will sound terribly ageist because I'm now a cranky old man, but I think if you have a look at the ranks of public servants in the major advice-giving departments, they're bright and they're enthusiastic and they're very, very committed, but they don't have the wisdom of age. They haven't been around long enough. And I think we're just repeating the mistakes that were made generations ago now. Yeah,
well, as you said earlier, we're a very educated society today. But as a student of history, I did a history degree at university. Not many people study history anymore.
No.
And it doesn't take long to realise when you study history that history always repeats itself.
It does.
And a lot of people today don't realise that history is always repeating itself. And like you said, they jump into these things thinking it's going to have a different outcome, but it rarely is. Have you got any thoughts on that, Gavin?
I'm just thinking that we've talked down a lot of what's happening in the budget, a lot of negativity to a degree. But I think I just to encourage people to think about the fact that to some degree we don't need to worry about the federal budget and just think about our own financial situation and work towards making that the best that you can. Don't get caught up in the negativity or the changes at that level. Just get your own house in order. Focus on those tax cuts, getting them off the mortgage, getting down to the practicalities of not getting caught up in all the stress of what's happening at the federal level.
Maybe get a good financial planner too, Gavin. Always comes in handy, doesn't it? But
I can do.
we do have a caller, Richard from Austinville, which is in New South Wales. Richard, have you got a comment or a question for us today?
There's quite a few things bubbling around in my head with this budget, but one of the structural things is, and it's actually two areas of the budget. But my father mentioned, previously when the Liberals are in government that they were talking about gas and electricity and all that sort of stuff, and he mentioned that private enterprise won't pay for for new gas projects and things like that. But in this budget with climate, they're putting so much towards climate, and the one issue is why instead of the government paying for all this renewable energy stuff, are the private corporations not paying for a majority of it, and they're not reflecting that in the budget. And the other thing is they're stripping money from defence, and they say they're spending more, but they're building the best navy, but we're going to have an inferior air force and inferior army because they're funneling money off to other areas.
Okay, so there's 2 points there. Rodson, I'm going to go to you first. So the question was, why is the government throwing all this money at renewables and the private sector's not doing it?
Look, because it's not profitable and it's risky.
Yep.
So the private sector would have done their calculations. They're not silly, and they realise it is very risky, and the profits are a long way in the future. And the government has decided we're not going to use nuclear energy or actually any kind of thermal energy for firming purposes. We might do some pumped hydro, we might install some batteries, and we're going to put a lot of effort in developing so-called green hydrogen. I don't know how they produce the green electricity to produce the hydrogen, but anyway, I guess that's a technical issue that someone's going to resolve. So part of it's ideological because they don't want thermal electricity generation to be part of the mix into the future. So that's a big issue. I just can't remember the other issue that
so the other one was defence, wasn't it? Why is yeah.
Look, I think this is something worth spending a full hour talking about. I believe, biblically speaking, the major role of government is security. And it worries me enormously that this government, but not just this government, but previous government, dropped the ball. I think we're living in an increasingly dangerous world, and Australia does not have the capability to credibly keep enemies at bay. And it'll take 30 to 50 years for us to build, and we're not doing it. We're talking about it, but we're not actually doing it. And, I'd love our politicians to go away and read some books on the history of walls around cities. When walls were built as a defensive mechanism, it actually allowed some citizens to transition from being fighters to being farmers. And that saw magnificent lifts in human flourishing. Look, without good defence, both internal and external, we don't have a good future economically, let alone in any other area. And I'm greatly disappointed, really, by what's happening in that area. And it's not just the current government. This has been going on literally for decades.
Yeah. You got any thoughts on that, Gavin?
On the defence side of things?
Either or the renewables, both comments.
Yeah, I think I just reiterate, Rod, agree on both things, both fronts. Renewables just aren't sustainable without government support. Look at Germany, their cost of energy has gone through the roof, and they've tried to use renewables. They've ended up with fossil fuels funding supporting half of the energy use. So it's there's no case around the world where it's actually working, and so it just needs to be subsidised by government if you've got that approach to energy supply. And then on the defensive front, all the fund managers at the moment are all talking about geopolitical risks at the moment. So there's a heightened focus on potential for war and how that will impact investments, and I think it's a real shortfall to not invest in our defence as a country. So I totally support Rod's comments on that.
Just one other thing. I mentioned before about budget, and I think it was the first speaker said that they haven't invested enough. But Morrison's spend up of 270 billion on, and I haven't seen a government do this in 40 years. Wouldn't that have been a foresight future, like investing a lot of other technology and hardware that we didn't have military?
Yeah, but the trouble is it's not actually happening. It's mainly talk and very little action.
Right. That's because this government's cut it, but the last government was willing to get in and actually start the ball rolling.
Yeah, well, maybe.
That was from my point.
Yeah. Look, they did, and there's no doubt that AUKUS was a magnificent win for Australia, but we haven't done anything with it.
No.
Yeah, well, Richard, thank you for your two key comments, 2 key points there. Really appreciate you calling in and stimulating the discussion even further. And I think we'll draw a line now in the talkback lines as we just round up to a close. But, Gavin, I want to just thank you for trying to put a positive take on everything, because you're right. As Christians, we can't allow ourselves to get depressed, can we? We've got to stay positive, stay focused on, obviously, God himself. And, one of the verses I love in the Bible is Isaac sowed in a time of famine and he reaped 100-fold. He took I think he took an intelligent step. I don't think he was a risk taker that he just threw seeds on the ground and hoped. I think he probably looked at it, maybe prayed about it, and he thought this is a good time to invest. He invested and he reaped 100-fold. So thank you for that, Gavin, for putting a positive spin on this. And thank you for your expertise as well. Great hearing your voice. You're a good-looking rooster as well. Good looking at you on the camera this morning. And Rodson Hill, thank you so much for your time this morning. And as you said, I think we need to get you on a lot more and talk about some of these key issues. I love your thoughts on big government and on defence and the state of Australia. And you're not an ageist. You are a wise elder who, as you said, you've been around, you've observed, and I think your thoughts and your input today was outstanding. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this post-federal budget edition of 2020 Today.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Andrew.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
I needed that voice, Gavin. I needed it. God bless you guys.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.